And we're in. Hello, Dream Team. Welcome back to the AMP podcast, episode 4. And I'm joined here by AMP psychologist, Dr Garret O'Moore.
Hello.
I'm really looking forward to this one. I think this is going to be a really good one. Massive topic. We're going to be talking, of course, about psychology in more detail, and we're going to be touching on what it is you do, who you work with, and how you make people better. But just before we get on to that, I'll just talk a little bit about how we first met. Actually, we met coming up to 10 years ago.
I think about 10 years, yeah.
Yeah, and then we've worked together for the last 2 years in our co-coaching model at AMP. But before that, you were first on board as a client of mine, so you've been subjected to 10 years.
I know him well.
Of gym floor scrutiny. And I suppose in that time, we got to know way more about each other's approaches, and it was nice to discover lots and lots of common ground about the way that we worked with clients, the kind of things that we were facing, and then some of the, not methodologies, but some of the concepts that we were working with seemed to cross over quite a lot. Strength, resilience, flexibility, these terms seem to apply both to physical attributes and also psychological as well. So that's kind of where our journey started in terms of working together. But I'll hand over to you to explain a little bit more, I suppose, about what it is you do day to day and how it is that you make people.
Okay. Well, thanks, Russ. What I do day to day. So I tend to, I suppose, kind of broad strokes, I work primarily with adults, so 18 and above. I work essentially I work sort of the spanning from kind of coaching into the kind of therapy space. So that's it's quite a broad spectrum. So that can go, that can really be people coming in with like a very discrete thing they want to work on, to sort of a much broader kind of range of things. That there might be a range of kind of issues that people want help with. So the range of work can also go from, it could be sort of a number of sessions to potentially work that could be a few years in duration, really depending on what people want kind of help with. And so really, in the sense, I'm sort of led by the person I'm working with, obviously in terms of what is that they want help with, and that will massively inform, probably similar to your work, that will massively inform the focus of the work itself, right? So probably similarly for yourself, if someone came in and it was maybe an injury and wants to rehab, that might be quite different from maybe someone who's quite high performing athlete and is like looking for some tweaks or how to get them to kind of the next level, if you will.
So if we talk about job titles, because they don't quite always encompass exactly what it is you do. If we talk technically counselling psychologists, but there are other types of psychologists out there that people unfamiliar with the field generally will perhaps have heard of but not be aware of exactly what the difference is. But in terms of within counselling and counselling psychology, is yours a more sort of integrative practice, would you say, where you're actually bringing in lots of different approaches and then suiting to the individual? Would that be fair to say?
I'd say that's in terms of the way I work. So I would use what's probably called a more integrative approach. And that's really come from the idea that there's no one kind of size that fits all. And I don't think there's a sort of a one model that is going to work for everybody or every problem a person might bring. So the idea then is you essentially got a broad kind of toolkit that you're drawing on. And that was a lot to do with how I was trained as well. So it's kind of trained in a kind of a multimodal sort of approach. So the idea was you gain experience in a range of approaches, and then as you sort of develop your experience, you've got the option then to start to integrate. That being said, there probably would be particular lenses that I would probably more likely to look through. So there'd be sort of particular ways of actually looking at things, or the ways you make kind of links that I will tend to draw on more than others. So I'll tend to have my kind of favourites, if that makes sense.
In terms of how you actually, because you talked a little bit, you just mentioned there about your training, in terms of how you actually got to the position where you are now, you've held a range of jobs on the way to where you are now. Just talk us through briefly, without doing the whole CV.
Sure.
Paper round.
Yeah, we'll shave off the first 20 odd years.
That's it. Yeah. So just take us from the first sort of, I suppose, role in psychology then forwards, just so we can get a picture of the flavour of what those different roles look like.
Sure. So essentially when I was studying psychology itself, just the kind of more undergrad idea, I was kind of thinking, okay, what areas I'm interested in, and I was always interested in psychology, like people, studying behavior, things like that. I think initially when I started out, I was more interested in sort of groups and actually how we work as groups, and so that drew me more to sort of organizational psychology. So that's what I initially specialized in. So that was the idea of actually working in an organizational setting. You might be looking at things like how teams function together. You could be looking at leadership development. It could be selection assessment, things like that. If anybody has gone for job interviews now, you'll see a lot of these kind of assessment centres that they have to go through. Don't get me started on that. I think it's almost gone a bit far now, just in terms of what's been asked of people. So that's where I initially started. And then I initially started working actually in the city. So I was working in sort of within an organizational development team for a large international organization. That's initially where it started. I suppose, long story short, what I found most fulfilling was actually opportunities to do one-on-one work. So I found myself doing kind of one-on-one coaching within that organization environment. That's when I went, oh, this is actually a bit of a job I really like. I'm just not as motivated by the other stuff. And I think with a lot of the other stuff, there's a huge amount of organizational politics and stuff as well. Whereas I sort of have the sense that actually the stuff I do with the individual, if with good outcome, that's something they can take with them to sort of all walks of life. The benefits from that can be in their private life as well as their professional life. So that was kind of quite satisfying for me in terms of doing that work. Long story short, essentially the financial crash happened. We're talking back to 2008, and the team I was working in, essentially we got shut down. So I was going, oh, okay, well, that sucks, but potentially like opportunity. And so I took the opportunity to do some further training. So I did some more training coaching, and then just through kind of friends of mine, essentially who are actually doing what I'm doing now, I was having a chat to them about things. And there was almost one of those kind of conversations where your friend sort of goes, well, why don't you do counselling psychology? And I was a little bit like, that's a good point. Why don't I? And obviously, it took a bit of time and effort to make it all work. But then I did some additional training. And that's when I then found myself doing counselling psychology, which really is, counselling psychology. It's a very sort of, it's a broad based in a sense, but it tends to be more focused on working with individuals. It doesn't have to be that, but it tends to be more sort of therapy focused. Whereas other branches of psychology, you could have like clinical psychology. Now you might find there are of course lots of clinical psychologists who do one-on-one work with people, but their training tends to be sort of broader in that sense. So they might do stuff like in their training, they might be doing stuff on how to do a lot of assessments. So for example, they might be doing neurodiversity assessments. They could be doing assessments for kind of brain injury. They might be doing systemic work with families. So they've got this kind of really broad training, but it means they don't get into as much depth sort of initially. Whereas the counselling psychology is much more focused on actually one-to-one therapy. And that's what I was really interested in. So I sort of that's the reason I went for counselling psychology at that time, because I was like, I really kind of know what I want to do. All this other stuff is great, but I've got a bit of a focus in terms of work with the individual. So let's just dive right in and do lots of one-on-one work.
Nice. And so in terms of that one-on-one work that you're now doing, what is it that people tend to come to you with, and who are the people that you see? Because you're working in central London. So, I mean, me and Dan were having a conversation on the previous episode, and he was mentioning the specific factors of working in central London that he tends to have specialised in regards to nutrition now. And maybe it's something similar for you, but yeah, who are the people that you see, and what do you sort of mainly do?
So for me, it's still, although it's central London, it's still quite broad, just in terms of, so obviously working with adults. In terms of what people are bringing, it's still a very wide range of things. At least I'd say more like in terms of what we call like the surface presentation, the thing that the person's bringing is the issue. The issues tend to be kind of very broad. When you get to maybe the underlying causes, there might be a bit more in common. But that's sort of initial thing that brings somebody. So it could be things from just feeling kind of really burnt out at work, just feeling like really anxious. There could be low mood, depression, relationship difficulties, just a sense of like stuckness, or as people might describe it, like just feeling lost. Like I don't really know who I am, what I want, where I'm going. That's sort of more existential kind of difficulties. So that's kind of, that kind of covers so many people though. When you sort of think about that, just in terms of all those kind of difficulties. Addictions as well.
Addictions too.
Yeah.
Because I was about to say, we they sound like quite common human experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone struggles with those things at some point. But I suppose there might be something that triggers people to sort of reach out to you, particular life events that are stressful. However, there's still a fairly big stigma around going to see a psychologist. There's still a lot of, there's a fair bit of resistance. People feeling maybe they don't need one, or they shouldn't. They're not broken enough, or there is still that prevailing view. Do you come across that sort of stuff? People quite nervous when they arrive.
I think yeah, some people are. It's interesting. I think there's definitely been a shift. I've tended to find, without generalizing too much, I tended to find that it's men who tend to be a little more resistant about coming to speak to somebody about what's going on inside them. But that can also be a bit of a stereotype as well. But I've tended to notice that I find with sort of younger, so when I say kind of younger generation, so working with adults, so they're kind of clients who are kind of 18 to maybe 25 at the moment. There's a really big shift. You just don't notice that same stigma to that degree, which is quite interesting. And that seems to have sort of shifted quite fast. I don't know if there's a role, social media plays a part in that. There's obviously been a lot of kind of people in the public eye coming forward talking about mental health. There's podcasts on mental health, there's books on mental health. There's a lot of celebrities writing their own kind of books about mental health. So I think in that sense, it's much more in the discourse. So I think that's what helped a little bit. What I do find, though, is I guess the difference is, whereas maybe in the past there was more a sort of stigma around therapy, that you might sort of look at someone else and go, I don't know why they're going for therapy, like kind of what's wrong with them. I think what's shifted a bit more now is there's more that sense of therapy is a great idea, but I shouldn't really need it. So there's a kind of it's a great thing for other people, and it sort of advocates for other people to have therapy, but I kind of feel like I should be able to manage. So I get a bit of that, right? So therapy is a great thing in principle, but I should be able to get by. And so actually, what's going on that I need therapy? And there's a bit of a minimizing of it, a bit of a kind of these are like my first world problems, and I shouldn't really be here. There's a little bit of that still. That still needs work. In terms of just societally, still needs a bit of work.
Well, that's good to hear that you do see people all walks of life, different ages, different characters, because I think that's encouraging for people listening who are thinking exactly that. I totally agree that other people should be seeking support for their mental health, but it's just not for me. I think I've seen it very much in more recently in kind of women's sport, where you see girls getting more involved with sport because they've got heroes and people to look up to who are like them in the sport. And I think more of that in sort of professional circles and just in the general public, where you've got more people who are sharing stories about, oh, I've spent some time with a therapist, it was very good, I got this out of it. It then normalizes that as a thing that you want to do. If you want to look after your well-being, it becomes it will be a nice place to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly I'm seeing a lot of, I think for men particularly, seeing like a lot of sports people who've got this sort of stereotypes about them being like these guys are sort of the alphas, right? Like they're really strong, they're tough, they're fast. But they need to talk to somebody, like they're struggling, like what's going on, So I think that's really helped to kind of break that down. And as well as everyone else, I think, like I said, anybody who sort of people might sort of look up to or maybe aspire to have, or they may not know what their life is like, but they might assume, someone's in the public eye and like, oh, wow, they've got lots of money, they've got fame, and they can travel, and they go to all these great parties. How can they be depressed? Or how can they be anxious? There's that sort of idea that, oh, right, okay, so you can have these kind of challenges, and that's okay, and it's part of life a lot of the time. It doesn't mean there's this sort of sense that you're not, just because you're struggling with something, it doesn't say anything kind of bad about you, I think is the thing, right? It's like people don't sort of apologize because they break their leg, usually, right? So like kind of going into the doctor going, really sorry, doc, to be taking up your time, but, broke my leg, that kind of thing. Or this happened to me, that happened to me. Yet somehow I think with mental health, there's still this idea that, it's a sign of something like defective, whereas actually it's not. It's actually, what it's much more signaling is you want to be curious of what's actually happened to you. So it's much, it's not moving away from this kind of what's wrong with me, like as a kind of, is there some kind of character flaw in me, is just not helpful. What you want to be thinking more about is what has actually happened to me. My symptoms, my difficulties, my behaviors. if there's things that I'm doing that I'm finding are problematic, let's get curious and go, are they a reaction to something? Are they a coping? Are they a way of coping with something? Right? That's the thing to understand, right? So they're almost like adaptations to situations in the past often.
So we've talked a little bit about who you see and potentially why. For people out there who are intrigued about what sessions look like, the sorts of things that you actually talk with people about, and what the expectations are from therapy. What is it? What is it that you're doing in those sessions? What is it you're talking to people about? And how do you work with people to try and help them with whatever the problems are that they bring into the session?
So I guess I can obviously talk about my approach. If you speak to 100 therapists, you probably get 100 variations, but hopefully there will be some kind of overlap between us. I think that some of the initial sessions are actually really getting an understanding of obviously what the person is struggling with, what they want help with, and actually that's a question I do ask people. It's actually what is their expectation for therapy, or what would a positive outcome look like for them, because that can also help to inform me about whether I think what they're maybe looking for from therapy is actually a realistic thing. And sometimes you might be actually pointing things out to people. Actually, that may not be the most realistic expectation from the work together, or that's spot on. That's absolutely what therapy can help with. So that takes up a good bit of time in the initial sessions. Is that kind of getting to know they're getting to know the person, they get hopefully a sense of me and what I'd like to work with. They're really understanding what's going on for them, what they want help with, what a positive outcome would look like for them, will then actually inform the kind of work we're going to do. So
it's quite a rare opportunity for some people. Do you find that lots of people just being given the space to describe what's going on for them is actually quite transformational?
I think for some people, absolutely, there's almost a sense of relief or lightness. Like some people say, "Oh, I just feel like I just feel so much lighter." And I haven't, in terms of being active, I haven't necessarily done that much. Essentially, what I've done is I've held space for the person, and I've just been curious about about their experience. But I've not gone in with any kind of magical interventions or anything like that. But I think just having that opportunity actually to be heard, having an opportunity to really kind of think about themselves in that kind of way. Because I think so many of our conversations naturally we're engaging with another person, so there's much more kind of back and forth. And to sort of just be talking about exclusively about ourselves, I think a lot of people find a bit indulgent. It's hard for some people to do that. But in the therapy space, the way I would sort of work with somebody is, it's a relationship. It's a very special kind of relationship. It's a relationship where actually the focus is on you, like it's on the person I'm working with. So the focus isn't on me. So the two of us are coming together, but we're coming together to focus on you. And that makes it quite a unique relationship. And I think that's quite rare for a lot of us to have that sort of space, right? Because other relationships, there tends to be more give and take.
And where do sessions tend to go after that? You mentioned there the word active. You haven't actively done anything just at that stage. You provided the space. What does that mean to you when you're delivering sessions in terms of being active?
Mm-hmm. So, there's many different ways to be active. So they can be active in terms of how you're listening. They can be active in terms of asking, prompting or asking kind of follow-up questions. So someone might share something, and then you might just ask a clarifying question, or you might sort of, so it's not just a kind of I just sit back passively and the person, talks and I nod. If that makes sense, you kind of get it. You're a bit more sort of engaged in that sense of interactive. But it could also be I might hear something and I just go, hang on, that doesn't track. And so you could interject and go, hang on a minute, explain that to me. And so, for example, you might be pointing out sort of inconsistencies to somebody based on what they're telling you. Or you might sort of point out to them something like, actually, do you hear how you're describing yourself? Or do you hear, that doesn't quite track with my experience of you, for example. So there's things like that you can be sort of active in.
And what about the non-verbal side of sessions? Because I think if I was feeling nervous about going into a session where I felt like I was going into a session with a mind reader, which is often what you hear about psychologists, I don't want them to read my mind, and I was to try and protect myself from that, my body would probably leak all sorts of information out of what I was feeling about the conversation. Is that something you also look at during sessions as well? Is it something you're taking?
Well, absolutely. I'm not a mind reader. Just to be clear, I don't know many psychologists are. I mean, if they're mind readers, they probably wouldn't need much. A lot of the training would be not so necessary. But they probably need different therapy. The therapists probably would need a bit of work in terms of how do they switch that ability off, because that'd be a bit overwhelming. I think absolutely. I mean, a lot of it is about normalizing the fact that, of course, it's quite natural to feel a bit nervous or to feel a bit anxious or apprehensive, especially if it's the first time you've been to therapy. So that's sort of part of the process. But what I tend to find is that when hopefully people realize you're on their side and that you're actually there to help them, and you're not sort of there to catch them out or get them in trouble, that sort of thing. People actually tend to settle into it a bit more. That's what you tend to find. And if people are a bit worried about how they might be perceiving them or coming across, I mean, that just becomes really helpful information. And sometimes we can actually get curious about that in terms of why am I being sort of seen as somebody who you have to impress, or I'm actually working for you, by the way. So why do you feel the pressure to have to impress me or explain something to me in a way that makes you sound smart, or let's where is it kind of coming from? And I find that actually curiosity is a real antidote to anxiety. It's almost the opposite, right? If you think about when we're anxious, we tend to want to get away from the thing that is causing us to feel anxious. But actually, what do we tend to do when we're curious? So there's more of an approach thing. So often by just getting curious about things, you find that people they'll kind of settle into it a bit more. So you turn them more into an archaeologist in a way, or a detective. It's okay, where's that come from?
And then it allows people the opportunity to do a bit of self-exploration, hustle the outside world. Let's talk a little bit more discreetly about anxiety, because it's something that's super prevalent, and lots of people, everyone's experienced it, but lots of people feel like they struggle with it. You mentioned there obviously about curiosity, and that's one of the ways that you might deal with that, but how is it you go about explaining sort of anxiety to people and perhaps helping them to reframe or actually cope with?
Yeah, so there's different. You might find different people in sort of the fields of mental health, well-being. They might sort of define anxiety in slightly different ways, and I think that can be a tricky thing. That we sort of often use words in a very broad kind of way. When I'm sort of talking about anxiety with people, often when I'm working with somebody, what we try and start with is developing almost a bit of a common language. So when we use particular words, we both kind of understand what we mean. And so often when I'm sort of talking to people about anxiety, we sort of understand anxiety. It's a sort of biopsychological. So it's in the body, and to a degree it's in the mind, but it's primarily like a physical experience. So if someone is saying well, I'm feeling really anxious right now, I might say, well, what are you noticing? Or what are you noticing? If they sort of go, there's all these kind of worries in my head, I might say, okay, but that's like a cognitive process. What are you actually noticing in your body? And so that's kind of part of it. So helping people actually become aware of their anxiety, how they're experiencing anxiety. So what am I recognizing? And then somebody might go, oh, actually, my chest feels quite tight, or my breathing is kind of shallow, or I feel really hot, my heart's going fast. That's right, exactly. So they are symptoms potentially of anxiety. So part of it is actually helping people become aware of the sensations, because the secret in a way to regulating anxiety is actually to pay attention to anxiety. So you've got to know what sensations are anxiety. And by doing that, by bringing your awareness to the sensations, that often helps to take the edge off. So if I can sort of recognize that, ooh, when I'm sitting here speaking to Russ, my shoulders are getting a bit tense, and they're getting almost touching my ears. If I suddenly have that awareness now with you, I can actually go, okay, well, what if I just let them drop a bit? That's better. Or what if I kind of shake them off a bit? That's better. Or what if I gently bring my awareness into the tension in my shoulders? If I gently sit with it, what we often find is that tension will ever so slightly start to ease off. And then we get this thing where we're like, ooh, I've actually got some ability to regulate my anxiety. So what's quite nice about that is it gives us a little bit of confidence that we've actually got some influence over our body's anxiety response. So that's some of the work I might do with people initially. So it's almost what we call an anxiety assessment. So it's helping a person become aware of what sort of sensations of anxiety that they experience. Maybe the particular kind of levels, like how high can it get? What are the kind of the main symptoms? Things like that. So there's a bit of work in that. I'm sort of to simplify, obviously, for time, right? But another piece then, of course, is to sort of help people understand, this is the big piece, what actually drives anxiety. Because one way to understand anxiety is to sort of say, well, that's my body's response to a perception of threat or challenge. Okay? So then it's like, well, so what are the threats or challenges? So if I'm perpetually anxious, does that mean I'm feeling like constantly under threat or under challenge? And you want to try and understand that. Like, is that something that's actually genuinely in the person's environment, or is it more like a perception thing? So again, is it more like what we call like an external stressor, or like a driver, or is it a degree to which it's internal? And I think often when people come to therapy, I think there's a recognition, even if it's not sort of fully formed for the person, that there's a degree to which a lot of the pressure is internal. There's something within me that's driving a lot of my anxiety. And whether that's like I have really high expectations of myself, or maybe I have sort of like really perfectionist tendencies, it's either excellent or it's rubbish, things like that. There could be, or maybe I've got a real need to kind of please everybody. So I just get absolutely anxious and stressed out, trying to do like 101 things to the best of my ability.
Do you find that, I mean, you mentioned a couple of different approaches perhaps there. One of them seems to me to be very skills based. The idea of physically sitting with the feeling, trying to let your shoulders relax, becoming aware of your breathing, feels very non-invasive from a mind. It's not. I'm not sitting on a couch staring at the ceiling. You asking me about my childhood, which is, I think, what a lot of people are frightened of when they're going to therapy. I don't think movies have helped massively with regards to that image, but that feels like it's very accessible. And whereas some of the other stuff goes a bit further into the individual, individually, how are you responding to these things? Do you find people tend to latch on to one or the other, or prefer a particular route? Or do you find that people tend to be able to link them together quite quickly and use them in conjunction?
I think people actually are pretty good at linking them. And obviously, so I guess some of my role is helping people to make the links in terms of actually helping people kind of develop, you might say, the skills in terms of how to actually apply what they're learning. Because one thing, of course, is to sit and practice, relaxing in a nice, quiet environment. But then if you're sitting in an office and it's like really noisy and there's people going around you, how do you put that into practice? So that's another part of the kind of skills building, you might say, in terms of how do we sort of help you develop these kind of habits so that you can actually put them into practice in other situations.
And you mentioned, I'm jumping around a bit here, but you mentioned at the very beginning, you talked about helping people with burnout, and you tend to come across that quite a bit. How is that different to anxiety, and if so, how is it different?
So I think it can be a part of it, if that makes sense. So burnout's an interesting, and again, it's a label that's getting used, and there's a bit of a debate where people say, well, what is it? And it's typically been used in work sort of settings, and some people might say, it's a consequence of almost being consistently overloaded, or really at your kind of limit. So there's a lot of kind of concerns during the pandemic, for example. You may have just even on the news that people saying we're really concerned about nurses and doctors getting burnt out. And the concern was that essentially they're either all going to be signed off sick or they're going to leave the profession because they just can't take it anymore. So there's that sense of actually you're just kind of at your limit for too long and you're just not getting the recovery. Why burnout, just in terms of the people who study it, why it can be kind of quite insidious in a way is that people often don't always recognize the warning signs of burnout. Right? So for some people, it could actually be, there could be the sort of feeling very anxious about things, but there could be other things actually where some of the signs are actually things like lack of engagement. So it's actually just not feeling as motivated about, for example, if it's work, it's just like, I just don't really, whatever, right? Just not that fussed.
Start withdrawing from activities and situations.
Yeah, and relationships as well. So they could be withdrawing from that kind of colleagues, but then they might also just at home with family, friends, they're just kind of pulling away. It's almost like you just can't.
Where does that come from? Is that just a desire to want to get the input that's coming in down, or is that an emotional thing?
It's. I mean, I think that's not something I've a very clear. I've got some, I guess, ideas, just in terms of what's going on there. Whether there's a degree to which it's kind of just a protective mechanism, but you're really just at the end of, you just come to the end of your tether in a way, and you need a break, or whether it's a sign your system in a way is almost kind of shutting down a little bit, that you're just so exhausted.
Does that mean I got burnt out after 4 days spending time with family over Christmas? I just started to withdraw.
Yeah.
After a while. Is that
I mean, you put me on the spot there. Should you call it like a mini version? I wouldn't say it's like a clinical thing, but it's maybe sort of a mini, maybe you got a mini version. But you could almost think about it. I mean, that might be the mini version, but if you think about that in a big way, and then I suppose the question is how quickly did you sort of bounce back?
Yeah,
yeah. You see, I think that's the thing when people have that kind of, when it's quiet, when it's quite pronounced, that like taking a week off just doesn't quite cut it. It could be quite a while that people are impacted. Where they've done quite a bit of research, for instance, would be with health professionals. And one of the terms that they've sort of used is they have this term called compassion fatigue. And that's often one of the things that would be sort of a warning sign of a sort of burnout, which is almost like you can imagine maybe, a nurse or doctor, and they've got into their profession because they really want to help people. And they essentially get so burnt out with compassion fatigue, it's almost like they just don't care. And not like in a mean way, like they're just so fatigued. It's almost just like, and it can seem almost a bit like the empathy's gone or the compassion's gone. And it's really just a sign of that kind of burnout. It's just like they're absolutely exhausted. And because that's a real way in which they are strained. It's a lot of care for people, then potentially, as professionals they can be, you can get sort of distressed if, for example, something bad happens to someone you're working with, or they die, or what it might be. And especially you can imagine during COVID, nurses and doctors, if they weren't really sure how to treat people. There's lots of people sort of dying, and actually to be sort of emotionally involved in that takes a toll. And so actually to withdraw is almost a way to protect yourself. It's almost like I have to become kind of to shut myself down to be able to function, and that's often how it's then seen as a sort of, it's a warning sign. It's a kind of protective mechanism, but ultimately it's not. If it continues, then things just kind of get worse and worse.
Yeah, so these things, just listening to you talk about both anxiety there and burnout, it sounds like there's these little red flags that almost pop up, and when they start accumulating, it becomes more difficult to recover from without additional support from outside or without.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, some people. It really depends on people's experiences and what kind of tools people have. I think with something like anxiety, for example, it's really important to also normalize anxiety in the sense that anxiety is, it's your body's response, like I said earlier, to a perception of threat or challenge. So you want to have that reaction. I mean, if someone said to me like, I just never want to feel anxious, that's a little bit like if someone goes, I'd like you to turn off my pain sensors. I was like, all right, so just put your hand on the hot plate then. You don't want that feedback, right? So because that helps you, right? So I put my hand on the hot plate, pull my hand away. Okay, I've now saved my hand. If I didn't have that, right, we're gonna cause some damage. So in a way, we want to have the capacity to feel anxious. The tricky thing is often people come to therapy is it's the recognition that their anxiety just feels disproportionate or it's just ongoing. So they're not getting the kind of what sort of healthier that you might have anxiety sort of will spike in response to a particular situation. But once you pass through the situation, the anxiety drops back off and you're kind of more back to even keel. I think most of us manage that okay. If we sort of go, oh, I've got this presentation I've got to do, I'm just feeling a bit anxious, I've got these exams coming up. Hopefully we're able to kind of manage it. When it becomes more of a difficulty for people is when they're just saying, like, I'm anxious every day. And there isn't necessarily, the exam or the death. There's not that kind of very clear thing to kind of link it to. Or it's not something that kind of goes away. Like they just say, well, I just get anxious in social situations. But they realize that actually just avoiding social situations is not really an option.
On a long-term strategy.
Right. So then they go, okay, so this is a tricky one.
And that leads us on quite nicely actually to sort of what people could be doing themselves to, I suppose, mitigate some of these things from occurring, to maybe buffer themselves against some of these pressures. Is there advice that you find yourself giving, repeatedly? Are there common themes that things that people can be doing on their own?
I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose sometimes, like with everything, when you're giving general advice, there's always the risk it can be a little bit sort of generic. But I mean, I'd always be trying kind of checking out basics with people. I'd always be getting, when I say basics, I would be looking at things like, how is sleep? How is exercise? How is kind of nutrition? Things like that. Do they have like a sort of support structure? Are there friends or family, people they can rely on, or other people in their lives that they can kind of talk things through with, or that they feel sort of supported? So they're definitely things that I'd sort of look for. And essentially, if they're there, it's sort of nurturing, whether it's relationships. It's always recommending to kind of put some time into relationships, the same way that you'd say put some time into kind of exercise, into eating well, all that kind of stuff. That's all kind of really important. I would say, sort of, if I was to really sort of simplify in terms of as best as I can, like if someone said, well, what do you kind of, if you boil it down, what are you sort of really doing with people? Or trying to help them with, I'd probably say actually it's ultimately all about relationships, is what I'd say. The kind of current, not everything, of course, but a lot of it's about relationships. And what I mean by that is I'm either struggling with how I'm relating to other people, or I'm struggling with how I'm relating to myself. And that's really what it's about. So a lot of my work would actually be helping people to just become a little bit clearer about how they're actually identifying or relating to themselves. It's like, do I actually interact with myself like I'm my own best friend? Or do I actually treat myself quite badly? Right? What is if there's like the voice in my head, how is it most of the time? Is it generally like encouraging, or is it pretty harsh or critical or punitive, or is it quite a worried voice? Is it like, oh my God, this is going to happen, and that's going to happen, and what's going on actually inside myself? So that's often where it helps people to kind of, not everybody, of course, but that's often a go-to in terms of helping people kind of recognize, at least to start with, how they're kind of relating to themselves internally, what's going on kind of internally, and then you're really looking at sort of how, if it is quite sort of a negative or a critical relationship internally, like how do we improve that? How do we change that? So that would be, I suppose, one thing I'd be, just for people, if they are kind of curious, if they'd like to be a little self-reflective, is maybe, just check in and go, well, how do I actually, how does that little voice in my head treat me from time to time? If something doesn't quite go to plan, what does it tend to do? Do I get the, idiot? Or do I sort of go, oh, well, these things kind of happen. So what is that kind of relationship like internally? So I think just becoming aware of that can be quite a good thing. It does it takes effort, in the sense you've got to pay attention to it if you want to kind of notice it. But that would often be an area of a direction of travel for people. Another thing, I suppose, if it was just in terms of like a tool, the kind of the quick win almost, I would say definitely just have a set, become more aware of how you breathe. And you've probably seen, there's been tons of stuff in the media. You've seen these guys like Wim Hof, and there's a lot of stuff on kind of breath work out there. But even with all of that, I'm still, every day I'm working with somebody, you sort of go, I just check, are you aware of how you breathe? And a lot of people are like, no. And actually just becoming aware of that can be so helpful, because it's a really quick way to access your essentially like your nervous system. So I suppose the thing with breathing is that it's very few. I think it's, as far as I'm aware, it's one of the few, of only ways that it's like a process that's automatic, in the sense that my system will just happily breathe without me bringing awareness to it. But I can also consciously change my breathing. Like I can hold my breath, or I can take a big exhale. I can't do that with my heart. I can't just go stop beating, go fast, slow down. I can't just crank up my body temperature at will. I can't just go sweat, get cold, right? Digest food faster, right? All these kind of automatic systems, I don't have access to them. but actually with breathing, with training, we do. And the great thing is that actually, because essentially what we've understood is that when we're feeling anxious or when we're feeling stressed, what you tend to find is the nervous system is more active. So what you tend to find is the breathing is probably a bit more rapid, a bit more shallow. And essentially by consciously countering that, by going, well, what if I slow down my breathing? What if I breathe sort of from the diaphragm instead of from my chest? What if I do like slow inhales, slow exhales? If I slow down the nervous system, well then, because anxiety is a physiological response, you essentially reduce your anxiety. So that is kind of a way to get some influence. And so that's often something I would help people with. Now, it's not going to be, it's not some kind of cure-all, but I think it's quite nice for people when sort of go, ooh, I actually have some internal tools that I can take with me wherever I go. And so I don't only have to be reliant on external things. And that's sort of a tendency. We're often looking for the external. I need a beer to take the edge off, or cigarettes, or chocolate, or ice cream, whatever it is. We're always looking for the things outside of us. And, they've got their place. I don't want to knock it at all. But I think it's really nice to also go, ooh, I actually have built-in tools, given whether you say from nature, God-given, wherever you think they come from, but they're within us, and I can actually develop them, and they're really powerful. And so that's often, in terms of, if you're asking like kind of quick ones, I'd be thinking, right, okay, how do I breathe? Is that something I can improve? And also that kind of relationship to self, is there something I can kind of clock in there? And if I'm being a bit harsh, is it possible to be a little bit kinder to myself? And this won't work for everybody, but one thing I sort of recommend, just to try and just see, if you're giving yourself a really hard time, if you sort of say to yourself, okay, if my friend was in my situation, would I be as hard on them as I am on myself? Now, this doesn't work with everybody, because sometimes if I ask a client this, they go, oh yeah, totally. I'm absolutely as judgmental of others as I am of myself. I go, okay, great, we've got some more work to do. Right? But a lot of people actually go, oh no, I'm actually giving myself a way harder time. And I go, right, okay, well, what if you treated yourself the way you treat a friend? And so that can actually be a nice little way for people.
It's good listening to you talk for that long about all of those different practical elements, because I feel like you're sort of the analogy that sort of popped up as you were talking there in my mind is you've got this massive orchestra of tools, as you were saying, like these internal tools, these things that you can be doing to try and help with your mental health. But actually, often we're all operating just using a small section of the, and sometimes mine's operating using the percussion section, which is bad times. It's really just smashing away. And actually, there, as you were talking, it's almost you're the sort of conductor, just pointing the awareness to different parts of the orchestra you can start to bring in to kind of optimize really how you're dealing with different situations, how your, as you said there, your relationship to yourself, relationship to others is then influencing how you experience stressful situations or how you feel about approaching, big life events perhaps that would normally trigger, that kind of response. But now you've got this plethora of tools that you can go to, and recognizing when you are being affected also sounds like a massive takeaway for people. If you can tap into being more aware of how you're feeling, you give yourself the best opportunity of being able to pick from those tools correctly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, we've run out of time, but I wish we had more time. We'll come back and cover some more stuff. I'm sure there's lots to talk about, but thank you very much. I've enjoyed it immensely, as always. And if anybody is interested in getting in contact, then please do get in touch with us. Opportunities to work with Garret, and also checking out the AMP app and the content that we've already got available on YouTube and on our socials. And of course, the message goes out there to generally around mental health is just getting that conversation going. If you feel like you're struggling, it's better that you talk to somebody and start that ball rolling, and then eventually get yourself to the support that you need.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Russ.
Pleasure. Until next time.
Until next time.
Thank you.